Welcome to In the Ven Zone with Christine McKay, where we get candid about what it takes to negotiate effectively. You'll learn from the challenges and successes of entrepreneurs, executives, and experts. We help you change the nature of your negotiations and get more from every deal you do.
Welcome back to another episode of In the Ven Zone, where we help you, the small and mid-sized business, elevate your negotiations. We help you by bringing you amazing stories, tactics, information, ideas, methodologies, all sorts of goodies to help you really figure out how to negotiate more effectively, more profitably, so that you are wildly successful in achieving your objectives. And today, and I say this every time, and I know all of you who have just been amazing listeners, and I'm so glad and so grateful that you have subscribed to this podcast. I really appreciate you. But all of you hear me say this every time, and so now it's kind of become a joke. So I think I might make it a thing where I just say, I've got an amazing guest for you, because I really do. I work really hard to try to find the best people to bring on the show. And today is no exception. Brian Mooney, who is one of my dearest friends, and I have known him for over a decade, and he is just remarkable. And I have been so excited about having him on the show. And let me tell you why. So Brian is in charge of Mooney Industries Precision Machining. Now, the thing is that you've heard of some of the major projects that he and his father, who started the company, have actually worked on. You might have heard of the space shuttle program, or maybe the Mars rover program, and I think even the International Space Station. So what Brian does is he and his team of, I think you have 16 people?
Yep.
12 to 16, depending, manufacture really small parts for the aerospace defense industry. And he is amazing at what he does. And so when I talk all the time, as you guys know, about David and Goliath negotiations, because I love doing David and Goliath negotiations. Well, Brian lives David and Goliath negotiations every single day that he is at the office, and probably some days when he's not. So Brian, welcome. So grateful to have you here on In the Ven Zone. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you for inviting me.
So tell us a little bit about your story and how you got to where you're at now.
Yeah, well, when I was 11 years old, my father bought a machine shop. He'd been doing work for a lot of the primes back then, with a fair sized shop in the valley. And that shop sold. And once it sold, he wasn't happy with the new leadership. So he went out, bought his own shop, and me and all of my siblings started working. So I started machining at 11 years old. Back then, we did a lot of Navy radar and pieces like that for still defense industry, but different than what we do now. About 35 years ago, we kind of transitioned over to doing almost all space. Got in with a few local people who that's what they build, and started building little parts for them. And they liked what we did, and they started giving us more and more work and more responsibility, and listening to us a little bit more about what we do and how we do it. And we're fortunate that we're close to a couple of them, so engineers can spin in and talk to us and talk about, what their project is and what they're trying to build. So I get to get in the back end of what they're going to do quite often. And that really has helped keep work here, because a lot of them don't want to work with a little guy.
Right.
But when you've solved problems for them that they had an issue, they didn't know how to fix it, and they said, we need something, we need it in a week. And you're small enough to say, I can do that in a week, and jump in and drop everything and just fix their problem. It gets you in a different spot. So that's kind of how we got to where we're at, is being able to respond to those things and to design fixtures and tooling and things to build stuff that a lot of people don't do. So
I love that, because one of the things that you just, without actually using this language that you talked about, is, and this is a benefit of being a small business, because a big company can't drop everything in their production schedule. They can't make massive changes on their manufacturing lines at a drop of a hat to solve a problem. And so a smaller organization can do that. And that's one of the ways that you start adding more value, because when you are developing pricing, it's not just about the price, it's about the value, because a lot of times as a smaller organization, you may be a lot more expensive because you don't have the same contracts for shipping. You don't have, access to a larger workforce to ramp up or ramp down the manufacturing line, et cetera. So I love that, because you get in with them, you help them solve problems, and you do fix it. And then that adds more value and makes you more important to them. So tell us a little bit about kind of, because your dad's still involved in the business.
Yes.
But you're managing it on a regular basis, and he's there 7 days a week. And I can pretty much attest to that, except for the days that Brian and I are at Burning Man, because we are both burners. So if there are any burners listening, shout out to you. So that's actually the first time I talked about Burning Man. So we'll have to bring that up in the show more often. So tell us a little bit about your operation. Kind of how big is it, and kind of how you organize and work.
Yeah, well, we have two 5,000 square foot buildings. They're right next to each other, separated by a driveway. Basically, we have a small office staff. There's only 16 people total, and that includes a few part-timers. My oldest guy is now 85 and still works 3 days a week because he likes it here. It's pretty much a family-run business. Mom's the major owner. Dad and I own the rest of the buildings, the business. So it's a women-owned small business, which helps with some of the contracts with the primes also, because they need those things. It's not why we get most of our business, but it helps them check a box that helps them keep some of their business. So Dad, as he has retired, he called it incremental retirement. He started taking off an hour earlier for about 5 years till he stopped working at noon. And then he started taking off days. And now he only works 2 half days. He comes in and handles insurance and some of the tax stuff and some of the HR things, and bring somebody new in. I interview them, hire them, give them to Dad to do the HR, fill out all the paperwork, make sure that, they've got the manual and done that sort of stuff, and get them kind of up to speed on what's going to happen and who's really in charge. And really it's me. We're now at the point that I run the entire office and shop, which has been an advantage of one of the things I've been on with a supplier advisory council for a prime. And we have discussions and they go, "You're the only one who understands the whole process." And I said, "It's because I'm the only one that walks it from quote to contract review to manufacturing to inspection and to shipping, because I'm involved with all of those." So I follow a lot of those things that get lost in some companies. But it's also how I maintain quality, is that I'm on top of every job because I see them every day. My office is in the middle of the building. Most of the offices are either at the front or the back of the building. Shipping's at the back. All the contract offices are at the front. I purposely left mine in the middle of the manufacturing plant so that I see everything that's happening and I hear everything that's happening. And you hear a thump that doesn't sound right and you get up and go find out what happened. And I don't get that report 4 days later after somebody says, "I broke a tool, I did this." And we went around, had to chase it down. Somebody else had to order a new tool. We're back up and running. I walked out, saw that it happened, walked in, ordered a new tool, and have the guy back up and running, which also saves some time on things like that. And that there's not, at our size, there's not a purchasing guy who gets a request for something and then goes out and buys it and then supplies it to the guy who puts it in the tool room, who then checks it out to the guy who needs it. Ours walks in and sits down there. So as we have grown with the space stuff, I've done a lot of concurrent engineering. So engineers actually come in, we sit down and talk about the project, what they're going to do, and how to give them the part they need, regardless of whether it's on the piece of paper or not. So if we look at contracts that I get to kind of negotiate around the edges are those, and I'm not doing it. It's the engineer walking into the buyer and saying, yes, he's more expensive, but he knows what we need. Nobody else, everybody else you send a piece of paper to, and they read the piece of paper. They didn't discuss this is what it says, but this is really what it's going to do. So we get some value added stuff on maybe 5 to 10% of our contracts because of that. And it's because of being involved in the back end.
Now, for those of you who are listening who are not familiar with how the government contracting process works, so Brian's used the term prime a few times. Just for those people who are not familiar with that term, can you just explain that to them?
So the prime contractors are the ones that have the contract directly with the government. They use sub-tiers to build most of their stuff. So, if regardless of what you're building, an airplane, a rocket, a washing machine, you have a contract with somebody to build it, and you're not going to build every piece of it. So all those big contracts, which are multi-million-dollar contracts, get broken down into a bunch of smaller contracts that go out to a bunch of small vendors like I am. And then after that, I end up with contracts to sub-tiers for me because I don't do plating. I don't do heat treating. I don't do what they call special processing, because each of those require a whole nother bit of oversight that usually the prime oversees them, but I'm the one that writes them the contract. So I'm the one that has to make sure that all the flow downs from the initial contract flowed through me all the way to them. So we have a whole system in place on how that works. And we've actually kind of designed what we want and how flow downs go in and how they flow down to our bottom contracts and end out at our sub tiers. So all of that gets flowed back to the prime, and all of that information has to be tracked.
Right.
So, but the prime is really the person who has it with NASA or whoever the main government entity is that it's eventually going to go to. Most of ours would either be NASA, the Navy, or the Air Force.
And what's interesting about that is that, I mean, you have, because you sit kind of in that central part below the prime, but you have subs underneath you, your negotiation for the work that you do, for what you're selling up to the prime, becomes very complex, because it's essentially a multi-party component to it, because you have these subprimes that are actually doing things to the product that you then are delivering to the prime. How has your ability to manage that, or kind of, actually, that's not the right question that I'm trying to ask. Because I love those kind of conversations, because I love that complexity. It gets me really excited to talk about that stuff. But what has worked in managing that kind of level of complexity in your relationships with the prime contractor, and what has been challenging for you in managing those subprimes as you're creating your notion and your idea of price and how you're going to deliver product and all of those kind of things?
So if we're looking at how, again, this is all evolved. We just did a 3-year project of digitizing everything we did back from the 70s.
Wow.
And I went back there and looked at what we used to do. And we did much the same thing we do now, but the documentation has gotten so much more strict. It used to be I would tell somebody, do it to this standard, and they'd do it to that standard and give it back to me, and that was fine. I'd tell the prime, this is who I used, and we were all good. Now the flow downs have gotten so heavy that all of that is in their contract, and they give me 30 different quality codes, all that apply to me, or half of which apply to me, half of which are on their contract that may not apply to me at all. But because they're on the contract, they just put them on and send them to me. We take the time to pull those out that don't apply to the sub-tier. So we actually read all those, decide what to do to them, have a chart basically inside our MRP system, our shop operating system, that if it has a note on it, or actually a little arrow, it says flow it down, and it flows down to all my sub-tiers. So I can review that. I can give that to my inspectors that come in from the prime and say, this is what I'm flowing down. Do you agree with it? And make sure that I'm not overloading somebody that's often larger than I am, but maybe not as adept at going through all of the extra codes and knowing what doesn't apply to them.
Mhm.
Because if you send them the 30 codes, they start making phone calls.
Right.
What about this code? What about that code? Well, can you cross that off the list? Can you do this? So if you do all that work up front, it gets rid of those phone calls and gets rid of that communication back and forth where I'm redlining basically a purchase order, which in this case is a contract,
Right.
to say, yeah, you're a plating house, electrostatic discharge doesn't apply.
Got it.
But ESD is a flow down to almost everything I do, and almost nothing I do has electrostatic issues because I build metal parts. I don't build parts with electronics in them.
Mm-hmm.
But because they're going to go in a missile that has electronics in it, ESD is part of the flow down from the government.
Right.
So the prime should have never flowed it to me.
In the first place.
Correct.
But
But they don't do it by part.
Right. Exactly. And so again, you're adding value, even going downstream by taking and doing that work up front. Now there's value to you because one of the things that we've talked about many times is, and people on the show have heard me talk about a lot, is that it sounds great to get a huge customer, a huge enterprise customer. So you pretty much can name any aerospace defense company, and Brian is or has worked with them in the past. And so you think about those companies and, some people get like super excited. Oh my God, that company is like my client. And they just think that that's like the greatest thing, but they don't understand the cost associated with servicing that client. And so what you just described is something that actually goes into that cost assessment that you have, because you're having to take this product that's flow down from the prime that isn't clean, essentially, it's not cleaned up. You're having to siphon through it to figure out what you're going to flow down to. Note, he said companies that are sometimes bigger than he is. So he's got big companies on both ends of the supply chain. Essentially, the customer is a big company and the supplier is a big company. And then there's Brian, who's got, depending 12 to 16 people working for him. And he's still figuring out ways to add value all the way through the chain, because that also is beneficial for him. And you've been able to bring that into how you think about pricing. So we had talked a while ago. You had a situation where one of your bigger primes had sent you a contract, and I've stolen this story and I've spoken about it because I think it just highlights, and I have negotiated with this particular company myself, and they have some very interesting contracts. So but they had put some things in the contract that you saw, and tell us a little bit about those, because you saw them and you knew it's like, holy crap, there's no way that I can do this. But tell us about them, and then I want to say why I think it's really important to have a conversation about this type of stuff.
Okay, so this particular contract was supposed to be for a long term for, I think it was 16 different parts. And they wanted quantity breaks at, 50, 100, 200, and 1,000. We got all those, got them their quote, sent it in, and they sent over the preparation for the contract, basically, that said, this is what we're going to buy. We're going to buy 250. We're going to buy them over 4 years. We have the right to only buy 10% of them at any time, and we have the right to cancel at any time. But they wanted the 250 piece price. So, you're reading through 40, 50 page contract, and you come across that, and normally at least two of us read them. So you read the 40 or 50 pages multiple times during the week, and you come across something that you go, wait a minute, this doesn't sound right. You're going to buy this widget from me at this cost. I'm going to go out and buy material for 250 pieces. I'm going to start processing for 250 pieces. Well, you run 10 different than you run 250. It's not just the fact that you bought more material. The setups are different. You might be doing a much more elaborate setup to do 250 pieces.
Mm-hmm.
So I basically had to push back and say, I will not accept this. You can have a plus or minus 10% of the 250, but you can exercise me for the first year and cut off the next 3 years. So we went back and forth on that quite a bit. And they finally just lined out that portion of the contract, said, we will drop that section. There were a couple other sections that were about as onerous in there. I complained about each of them, and they just took it out of the contract. They said, a manager thought that was a good idea to have in there. And I was like, look, you can, and you can have something that says you can terminate the contract, but then there's a termination clause that says, which is what we ended up on the next revision of that contract, was basically that they had the right to cancel at any time, but we had to fill out, after 30 days, we will have spent 30% of the dollars. After 45 or 50 days, we will be at 40%. And then it kind of goes a lot slower, because at the beginning, you buy all the material, you get all the stuff in. Once it's in, and then over the next year or two, it's another 10%, another 10%, another 10%. So if they canceled like in year 3, they would have given us 90% of the contract.
Right.
Even though they'd only received 50% of the product.
Right.
So that was what I had to get put back in there. And once they got that in there, we then had to give them a cancellation charge, which was basically by month, by day, what's it going to cost, and that's weird because it's in flux. Because they haven't told you exactly when you're going to ship them every part. So how do I tell you in month 12, this is what it's going to cost, when I don't know if you've let me ship a single part? So some of that, you kind of have to go by the seat of your pants and go, this is about what it is.
Yeah.
So we got done with that contract, and that one ended up in place with only a few of those parts anyways. They went through with the contract, bought all the parts, and none of the what ifs happened. So they bought all their parts, they got all their pieces. So it's kind of like, it was good to catch it. Had I not caught it, it probably wouldn't have bit me. But I did have one a few years back doing the same thing that did bite me. And it was how I knew to look for this. And it said, company has the right to change quantities. And it was another large thing. They bought, I think they quoted 100 of this one part that I had to buy an entire sheet of fiberglass for. And I'm talking a 3-inch sheet, 4 foot by 12 foot fiberglass. And I'm making a part this big. And I was going to make 100 of them.
And by the way, for those who are listening and not watching, this big is like, what is that? 3 inches and
3 inches by 3 inches square.
Yeah.
By 2 inches thick, 2 or 3 inches thick.
Yeah.
And they ordered 4 pieces. And we said, no, this isn't for 4 pieces. And that buyer basically said, it says we have the right to change quantities. That's the quantity I'm going to buy. We're not buying any others. If you don't do them, we will turn you off. So I had to eat that one, which is one of the ones that makes me watch for these. That's been over 25 years ago.
See, the thing that's so important, and this is one of the reasons why I started my company, Ven Negotiation, is because, when that company sent you that contract, I guarantee that there are companies similar in size doing largely what you do, who signed that contract, for whom that company actually did take the haircut on the product. They did cancel that order. They did reduce the amount that they ordered. And so those companies are, they're really, really damaging. And so the reason why this is really important is because that company who sent that contract to Brian originally, there are companies similar to Brian's that have actually signed that contract, but that actually didn't have the positive outcome that he had. They did not, they did get a haircut in the amount that was ordered, and they did eat costs. And the reason why these big companies do that is because they are banking on the fact that the majority of you are not sitting and reading your contracts and are not going to push back because you're afraid of losing the revenue. And the problem with that is that even if you get the revenue, that doesn't mean that revenue is profitable, and it doesn't mean that it's good revenue. Yes, I'll use that term. Might not be the best term, but I'm going to use it for right now, because you're taking on so much risk. And when I do presentations, I talk about contract risk and how there are 5 different types of risk, and only one of them is legal. So 4 out of 5, 80% of risk in contract is business related. It's cash flow related. It's profitability related. It's operational, or it's strategic. And this example that Brian is talking about is a classic example of operational risk that a company who isn't paying as much attention as Brian does and isn't into the details of his contracts, that those companies are taking on that unnecessary operational risk, absolutely could bite them in the backside coming down the road, and could cost you not just on that deal, but in some cases I've seen it cost people their entire company. And so you want to make sure that you're paying really close attention to that.
So that was that contract. Same company on a different contract has been trying to put a long-term in place. And it's usually fighting costs. They're looking at, how do we get a better cost? How do we get a better price? Okay, if we give you this over this many years, will you do it for this price? And this particular part is extremely difficult. I can only run about 40 of them at a time. And they're looking about, but we're going to give you a contract for 300. So we need this break because we're giving you a contract for 300. And I have had to go through like a spreadsheet with them over and over again, that it's like, well, but I have to break every 30 or 40 pieces to do machine maintenance, tear things down, rebuild fixtures, put things back together. So it doesn't matter if you give it to me for 5 years. I still have to do this work. So I can't give you the savings you're looking for. This is what it costs. They spent 4 years only ordering the amount they needed for that year. This year, we did a whole new contract on it. They made us go back through all of the proposals, insisting on giving them our close sheets for the year, so they knew how much money we make. They are now requiring to look at our close sheets every 3 months to know if we are still solvent. They're wanted all of our time cards. They want our traveler, which is a non-negotiable. You cannot have it. I will not tell you how I make your part. You may come in and watch. You can read the traveler while you're here, but we have had one company years ago, our traveler ended up at somebody else's place and they built some parts for a few years. They eventually failed and they came back because not everything's written in the document. There is tribal knowledge that no matter how much I write in a document, I can't explain everything about the part. So in fact, that part I got paid to fix and made more money on fixing the other guy's part than I did just building them in myself. So, but it taught me that nobody gets a run sheet, and all of the contracts ask for them. They want your traveler. We get your traveler. We get to know how you do this job. And it's no, can't have it. We send them back every time. That's one of the things we line out of contracts the most is you can't have my traveler. It's my intellectual knowledge written on a piece of paper that I'm not giving away. So anyways, so finally we've done this same negotiation basically 3 years in a row, and they've never bought the bigger batch. This year they came back with it again, and we basically said, we don't want to do this. You run us through all the stuff. You run us through all the TINA stuff, which is the Truth in Negotiations Act, which means, and it was anything over $500,000 up until 2 years ago, that they get all the information so that they know that you're charging them a fair price. Even though TINA has now changed to $2 million and this contract is under that, they still insisted on all the stuff because they said, well, our contract is more than that, so we have to give all this information to the government. So it took a long time going through that and deciding, okay, we're going to do what you're asking. But then we gave them information. They said it's not good enough. We need more. So I had to ask them, what more and how do you want to see it? So they gave me their spreadsheet and we worked through their spreadsheet. And we put in our hours and we put in that. And they came back and said, you can't have advertising. Advertising is not, it has to come out of profit as opposed to, and they said, this is a government thing that advertising is out of profit. So you can't charge that as part of the cost of the part. So I just said, fine, take my profit margin that I only had like 4% and make it 13. And they said, well, 8 to 20 is really the norm. And I said, yeah, I'll hit it right in the middle. You give me 13%. It raised the price of my product about 20% when we got all done with the negotiation, because I filled out their form their way and wrote it all down and said,
Yep.
this is what it actually takes to build your part. And they didn't like it necessarily, but they also didn't argue with it. It was like, this is our form. This is how it works. They sent in a auditor, and the auditor went through our books and everything else here and wrote the things down and said, yes, you're right. And in fact, you can put this on here too. So the stuff we do for, most of my advertising, I don't advertise really. My advertising is, the shirt that I'm wearing and supporting some robotics kids. And I'm like, wait, I can't give a local school money and have them come here and charge that time. It's what I do to make sure that we have people coming up. I said, nope, can't do that. But you can put it in your profit. So if you just raise your profit and say, this is my bottom line on what it costs to build this product, and this is the profit I expect to get, you can mess with that in their tool and be okay. And they'll read their tool and say, it all matches up. So we now got that contract. We've started on it about 3 months ago, which is 4 years of the same part that I've only known I was going to run for a year for the last actually 13 years. We've been running the same product for 13 years for actually several different companies because it moved from one company to another.
So what I really love about what you were talking about is something that I think is so important in any good negotiation or any effective negotiation. Let's use that term because that's a more effective term, in fact, is that sometimes we are constrained by what our counterpart needs. Now, that doesn't mean our counterpart is unwilling to negotiate with us. It means sometimes that we have to adapt to negotiate in a language that is consistent for them so that they can negotiate with whomever they're having to negotiate. And in Brian's case, what he's talking about in terms of using his customer's tool to develop his pricing proposal and to get the marketing component as part of a percentage of profit actually improved the profitability of the entire project, right? So part of it is actually making sure that you understand how they want things communicated and then how you can adjust and what that means for you. A number of years ago, I was working on a contract renegotiation. A client of mine they owed a massive liability to a vendor, and it was a legitimate liability, and they could not get this liability to go away. And so I got on the phone and they were like, they owed over $1 million and couldn't afford to pay it. And so I was like, well, we'll pay you $300,000 or something like that. And, they got fixated on the dollar number. So I changed the conversation and I started talking in terms of percentages. And we ended up settling that account and I saved my client 73%. So they accepted 27% instead of 30 just by changing it to talk about percentages instead of dollars. And so sometimes it's about figuring out what is the language that works, that triggers a different reaction in your counterpart, or that aligns with an expectation that they have, but that you can be flexible in so that you can get to agreement on that. Sometimes I'll say that no, except when it comes to sex. When it comes to sex, no is no. But in pretty much everything else, no is an invitation to ask a different question. And so that's exactly what Brian did, is he figured out how to ask a different question and then to respond to a question in a slightly different way. excellent. So definitely try that next time in your negotiations. So tell us, so one of the other things that you do, right? So you've got all these relationships with these huge prime government contractors, and but you also have like you have all this supplier relationship. And I'm really curious because you do a lot of metal parts, and I'm really curious because the price of steel right now is the highest it's been in almost 10 years. How are you seeing this things in the supply chain affecting you in your business, and how are you negotiating around that stuff? Whether it's the tariffs, whether it's steel prices or other commodity pricing that's affecting you.
Yeah. Being small, except for like this last contract, I usually don't end up buying huge batches of stuff. But if I do, I buy it up front. So when I got this new 4-year contract, all the material was bought now. So that protects me for that. One of my neighbors has had to do the same thing in basically buying a container full of the specific material he has to have in order to keep it at the right price. And he has a long-term contract also. So that's one of them. But for me, it all gets built into the cost at the quote. So I quote every piece of metal every time I quote a job. Quotes are only good for 60 to 90 days. Mm-hmm. So it has only bit me a couple of times that I quoted something, and when I went to buy it, it was substantially more. And by substantially, I'm talking 4 or 5 times as much. Normally, it's a 10 to 20%, and I've already built 30% into the cost of my material. That's my standard markup, is 30%. I have a few customers that argue with me about that. And it's like, look, that's what I get to write a purchase order, get the material in, check the material, make sure it's okay. And it covers me in case there is a fluctuation after quote, before purchase. So some of that has just had to get written in over the years and say, this is my percentage. This is what it is. And again, it's not one of those I really negotiate on. It's my customers will come in and say, well, we think you should do it this way. Except for this last contract that needed the TINA project. For that, I had to put in the actual material costs. But then I got to put in a handling charge and overhead. So for that, it gave me the way to put it back in, where my preference to give it to them would have been, this is what I pay for what material costs me, which would have been material cost plus 30%. They weren't taking that, but they would take this plus handling, plus delivery, plus storage, plus. And actually, it can work out better that way because it can be way more than the 30% by the time you get done with it. But
that's one of the things that, I mean, you are very well versed in the numbers of your business. Like and we've talked about this a lot of times. You just know the numbers. You know how much product costs. You know what the cost is that's going into producing that part. You just know it. And a lot of times, and I've negotiated with. I've had a number of clients that just don't know their numbers, and to develop a good negotiation strategy, especially when you're negotiating with these larger companies where everyone in them is a specialist on something, whatever it is they're doing, they're a specialist at it. And they have all of this, body of knowledge around, from their financials and their accountants to their lawyers to everybody in between. And when you don't know your numbers, you lose credibility in your ability to negotiate. And especially when you're negotiating with enterprise accounts. And they will ask you the most bizarre questions in the process, and you've got to be able to have an answer for them. And they will also redirect. And they'll try to get you to agree to things that if you don't have knowledge about your numbers, the details of the numbers, then you're going to do things that you're going to wake up and you're going to have, absolute contract remorse and go, what the hell was I thinking? Or you'll get into the contract and you'll be completely blindsided by additional costs that you weren't anticipating. And, what Brian's talking about is, the two things that you do really well, Brian, are one is know your numbers, and two, you know the contracts. Like you live in the contracts, and those are two things that a lot of small businesses and entrepreneurs work really hard to avoid. And you've taken those, and it benefits you in your business.
I like to say I read. Something comes in, I read. Another one I did again a few years ago with a new customer. They sent me over an RFQ, a request for quote, and it had a bunch of specs in it. I had to go through all their specs. I read 300 pages in 2 days of technical specifications, had 17 questions that I had to send back to them before I'd quote their job. And they actually held for my quote because of that, because nobody had ever asked them the 17 questions before. They had to go look. And people had to go say, why did we write this? And what is this here? So knowing to ask them also made me know that my competition wasn't doing that.
Right.
So it changed the way I deal with that company, and it changed the way they deal with me.
It absolutely, I mean, I was negotiating with a very large telecommunication company, and they had an operating manual that they incorporated into the contract. So, and what I mean by that, for those of you who are not well versed in contracts, is that embedded in the language of the contract, we were agreeing to adhere to the contents, to the procedures that were outlined in the operating manual. So I read the operating manual and I redlined, and they're like, what? And I'm like, I can't sign up for this. You want, and a lot of times what these bigger companies will do is they'll come in, and the first thing they go after, and you've kind of hinted at it a bit, they go after price. Like, well, how much are you going to charge us for this? And I'm like, wait a minute. That big contract with the operating manual minus the operating manual was a 110-page contract. And let me tell you, the amount of cost embedded in that contract was extensive. And it's like, I'm not telling you what price we're talking. We're not talking about price until we get through the rest of this stuff, because I want to know how much cost I have to incur in order to even have you as a customer. Right. And the more cost I have to incur, you want to get a discount, the more cost I have to incur, that hurts my margin. We got to make that equation work in order for this deal to work. And we figured it out. But this is one of the reasons why you need to read your contracts and know your numbers, because if you don't, then something like an operating manual that's referenced in the contract that you sign up to adhere to could absolutely destroy you in the future if you do something out of line with it.
And the new things, ISO, which has been around for a while, that is flowing down on all the contracts, is raising costs. And the new thing this year is cybersecurity. And it basically says you will be cyber secure. So there is all kinds of work that everybody my size and bigger, I believe actually anybody who gets any of this information has to do. And it's embedded in the contract. And of course, it's a FAR clause. So it's embedded in a clause, it's embedded in a clause, basically. And you have to go back and start reading all of those. And it is one of those that's going to get people a lot in the next few years, is cybersecurity and how do you become cyber secure. And if you're not watching for that, you either have to be doing it right now or figure out how to say, okay, I'll do this in 4 years. But the government's slowing it down, so most of us won't have that choice.
Right. And for those who don't know, a FAR clause is a clause that's very specific to government contracts. So if you're not servicing government contracts, you're probably not familiar with that. So, and you probably don't need to be. That is a government
And you're
contract.
lucky.
Yeah, exactly. So what are some of the things, right? So there are a lot of businesses your size and in your industry that have just gone out of business, who just like, I'm not sure if they've been impacted by COVID, but there's just a high turnover rate. What are some of the big mistakes that people make when it comes to negotiating in your industry?
Some of it would be taking on work you're not capable of.
Mm.
You see a project, it looks like a good idea, but you haven't done anything like it. Some of it is going after the wrong portion of the industry. So there are people who do a lot of aircraft work, and they do normally 2, 3, 500, 1,000 parts. I build 10. The parts look exactly the same, but aircraft people quite often give away the setup, the time it takes to get the part right before you build them. And they figure this part's going to take this long to run. And right now with the downturn, with the aircraft problem and the fact that people aren't flying, not as many of those parts are being built, those people go after my work. So even though the part looks the same, they're going at it after for what they understand is this is how we build a part and this is what it costs. And they're missing a lot of costs. They're missing the costs that the defense portion of it takes, which is the cybersecurity, and some of it's ISO, but a lot of the aircraft people have to do that also.
Right.
But there's another level of ISO that gets piled on top of what happens for commercial products.
Right.
So you end up with all of these other requirements that you weren't ready for. And some of it is just right now with the downturn is there's just not been enough work. You know, getting things back in this country and getting them working it's a long-term thing. It's not something that happens overnight.
Right.
Because there's not a factory sitting there ready to make something. You know, it got scuttled 20 years ago. And now that you need something made, you can't just say, hey, turn that one back on. All that stuff went away. All the knowledge went away. The knowledge of the people and everything that was in that building is gone. So a lot of the smaller startups that got started at a bad time, last few years, though there was an uptick going, it kind of turned down. COVID is a big part of it. Election years are a big part of it.
Yeah.
Doesn't matter who's coming into office. Things change. If you don't watch to see what's going to change or don't have enough work to get you through that, then you're going out of business just because you don't have enough work. I had a guy sitting across from me 2 weeks ago, an interview from a guy who owned a machine shop for 30 years, and his work just dried up and he decided to give up and go home. He was saying that he's not old enough to really retire. He has a few more years he wants to work. He's owned a machine shop. He's had all the stuff. He's got all the experience, but work just dried up and just wasn't worth trying to keep going.
Right.
So
one of the things I talk about is that negotiation is actually a hopeful act. We hope, we're entering into an agreement because we hope that the outcome will put both of us in a better place than we are today when we enter into it. Okay. And so if you think about negotiation as a hopeful act, what are some of the things that you hope for your industry in the coming years as you move forward and continue to grow Mooney Industries?
What hopeful act? Interesting question.
I know my lawyer friends laugh at me when I say that. So if you're an attorney and you're listening, yes, it's okay. Feel free to chuckle. Fine. But I'm right.
Yeah. You hope to grow your business, to get it bigger than it is today.
Yep.
I know several other shops that have grown exponentially, and that's not something I've ever really looked for. I want to grow a little bit every year because I want to keep control over what I have. But keeping enough work that you can grow a little bit without trying to add a whole nother division or a whole another group of things doing something that for me is outside my comfort zone. So I want more of what I have, but just a little bit more, and just to get a little bigger every year where I can still control it and not lose the personal portion that I still have, even though, yes, a lot of my stuff is very technical and you would think there's no personal relationships with it. I still end up talking to engineers and designers and things and get to talk about the product and what it's going to do and what's going to happen with it later. So those guys, I really enjoy that portion of the industry, is that they keep coming back around. People I've worked with for 30 years, I'm still working with. We've grown up in the industry together.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, one of my best friends from high school, I reconnected with about 5 years ago because he's working for one of my biggest customers. And he just showed up one day and it's like, well, you'd never built a part for one of my projects before. So I want to work those into it and keep those. For one, I think it keeps us both profitable and in people's minds.
Mm-hmm.
So that's it. I'm not looking for a giant growth, but I am looking for a small, steady growth over the years. And it's basically, except for a couple of downturns, what we've had for the last 48 years.
Mm-hmm.
So.
And the thing I admire about you and your negotiation style, and I'm going to assume that you learned a lot of this too from your dad. So hats off to him too. And he's a remarkable guy as well. Is, I always say that negotiation, a lot of people think about negotiation as a win-win or win-lose. And I just wrote an article for the LA Business Journal called Stop Trying to Win Your Negotiation, because negotiation is about a relationship and you cannot win a relationship. And so I see what you have done and what your dad has built, and you guys have, you embody that. Like everything you talk about in terms of how you create value through the depth of your relationships that you have with your customers and with your suppliers. You create, that relationship aspect is overarching, and everything that you've talked about today, relationship keeps coming into it. And so for those of you who are listening, kind of think about that and how you are managing your relationships in your business, and how are you guarding those relationships in your negotiation? What are you doing to elevate them? What are you doing to really create mutual benefit for them? Whether it's communicating to them in a way that they need to be communicated to make them seem better to their customers, or whatever it is. But making sure that you're focusing on that relationship aspect is, especially as a smaller organization where you have the opportunity to be personable, to really like roll up your sleeves and problem solve with your customers and with your suppliers, and to fix problems and to add value in that way. Those are things that from a negotiation perspective will endear you to your counterparts and make you more and more valuable to them. So, Brian, this has been really great. I really appreciate you being here. I have one last question for you. And you are the first guest that I'm asking this question. I'm trying to figure out a question to ask everybody at the end of the interview that has absolutely nothing to do with negotiation. So, what is your favorite thing to do in your downtime?
It used to be working out. It used to be getting into the gym with a bunch of friends and playing a game called volleyball that I played for 30 years. And as that has kind of waned because we've all gotten older and half the guys can't do it anymore, it's now getting out of town, which has not been something that has been my thing for most of my career. Most of my career, I probably didn't get a week or two's vacation a year. And about a year ago, I decided that that's what I'm going to do. Is I was saying 6 weeks. So sometimes it's 4, sometimes it's 8, but I get out of town, even if it's just for a weekend to go visit somebody, to just race out of town, go say hi, come back. Or Burning Man, get out of town and be gone for a week and just totally disconnect. And really what the getting out of town about is disconnecting, because I can't disconnect from here while I'm here. My brain doesn't work that way. It says, I'm here, I'm focused, I've got things to do. I can show back up on a Saturday morning and there's these 4 or 5 things I could finish, or come back in the afternoon, some other weekend, and finish up some quotes that I didn't get done during the day. So if I can get out of town, I can disconnect. So it's get out, maybe even turn off the cell phone. Say, though normally I don't turn it off, normally I try to get someplace, it doesn't work.
And that's okay, because then that's not your fault, right? You didn't shut
Right.
somebody off.
I didn't turn anybody off.
Coverage.
I'm out in the middle of Mojave Desert and nothing works out here. The camera still works, so you can take pretty pictures. But yeah.
Exactly. Well, Brian, thank you so much. I'm just, like I said, it's such an honor to have you. I've looked forward to having you on the show. And to the audience, thank you for spending time with us today. I really, really appreciate that. Time is our most valuable resource. And I am honored that you have spent time with me and Brian today. So thank you, Brian.
Thank you, and good seeing you.
I will be seeing you soon, I'm certain.
Yes.
Thanks.
Okay.
Thank you, everyone. Have a great day. Happy negotiations.
Thank you for joining us for this episode of In the Ven Zone with Christine McKay. We invite you to visit our website at www.ven.zone to access the show notes and other helpful resources. Empower the negotiator in you and successfully level the playing field. Join us again next time here on In the Ven Zone.